Hi, everyone. My name is Sam, and I'm a security researcher at the Threat Analysis Intelligence team in Checkpoint. And today I want to talk to you about a campaign we uncovered just a few months ago. So the campaign was targeting financial institutions in Africa, specifically French-speaking countries. And unfortunately, it's a part of the world that we don't often talk about in cybersecurity, but I think we're going to more in the future. Did you guys know that internet traffic in Africa is doubling approximately every 18 months? It's a really, really fast-growing market, but that makes it more vulnerable to cyber attacks. Okay, let's jump right in. The earliest file we saw in the DangerousSavanna campaign was right at the end of 2020. The campaign, as I mentioned, targets French-speaking countries in Africa, including Ivory Coast, Senegal, Togo, and Cameroon. And they did this by spear-phishing specific employees in various financial institutions in these countries. And as the campaign went on for about 2 years, the infection chains evolved a lot. But even with all this evolution, these guys were never that sophisticated, and they used a lot of open source tools and really poorly written custom tools. It just kind of seems like these guys were a bunch of script kiddies. But shockingly, all the emails were in French, but thank goodness for Google Translate. Now, in the emails, the threat actors pretended to be real financial institutions, such as a bank. They either did this by creating a fake domain, or if the domain they wanted to spoof didn't have a valid SPF record, they simply abused that and spoofed an email. Now, in one of the emails, they claimed to have found the employee based on not Facebook, on LinkedIn, but this seems like a pretty reasonable assumption considering it's a good OSINT source. Now, each of these phishing emails contained a malicious attachment. Sometimes they were PDFs, sometimes they were Word documents. In some cases, we even saw executables. Here's an example of one of those phishing emails that we saw. Now, notice that the threat actor impersonated a real bank called Tunisian Foreign Bank, which actually is based in Paris, but also serves Tunisia, which is a French-speaking country in Africa as well. And if you do a quick Google search, you'll figure out this is not their real domain. You can see there's also a document attached here, which in the email the actor refers to as a list of business-related proposals, but contains nothing of the sort. And notice here, after the bonjour in the beginning of the email, you would normally see the actual target employee's name, but here we've blurred their name out for privacy. So, the documents we saw attached to these emails, as I mentioned, were typically Word documents or PDFs. Now, most of these Word documents contain really generic lures, something about clicking the active content button, usually just to run macros. But in some cases, the documents didn't just pretend to be something like from Microsoft. Instead, they were trying to pretend to be like a financial institution, like a bank, and saying that the document was somehow secured by that financial institution. So we also saw that there were PDFs in these attachments that didn't actually contain any malicious code or nifty exploits or anything. They just had this button in French that said open document, but really it just downloaded the next stage payload. So here's an example of one of the Word documents that we saw during this campaign. So as you can see, it's a pretty standard maldoc lure, just in French, basically trying to convince the user that, oh, we're Microsoft, we're saying that you need to click the active content button, and then you can open the real document and see what's inside. But instead, all this really does is it just runs a macro. On the other side, we see a PDF, which just simply has this button in French that says open document. When you click it, it downloads the next stage. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about how the infection chains changed over time. In the very early days of the campaign, we saw really just executable files that were pretending to be PDFs. They did this by setting like a Adobe Acrobat icon on the executable and using a double extension .pdf.exe, which pretty simple. And with the default setting in Windows, This actually hides the .exe extension at the end, and it only shows you .pdf. So to the untrained eye, seems legit, right? So after that, we started to see more Word documents and PDFs in the middle of 2021, like I mentioned to you earlier. And the doc files usually just contain the macros directly, whereas docx files link to remote templates, which then had malicious macros themselves. But in 2022, we started to see a slight change here. They started to include ISOs and zips in their phishing emails instead. They also still had some documents as well, but they were kind of changing it up. One possibility for this was the announcement by Microsoft in early 2022 that they would start to block macros by default, but we're not actually entirely sure why they did this. And inside these ISOs and zips, we typically just saw an LNK file that would usually launch a PowerShell backdoor, but sometimes we also saw documents hidden inside these archives as well. Now let's move on to talk about the payload drop zones, basically the place where these guys hosted their next stage payloads. So at the very beginning, they hosted on in the first couple of samples, they hosted on 2 websites, one called FileSend and another one called Forcing, which are basically like really lesser well-known Dropbox type sites. It's a place where you can upload files. But in the middle of 2021, they switched infrastructure and they started using this other website called pastecnet.org, which basically is like also a lesser well-known site, but more like Pastebin, and also doesn't require any registration. The other thing is these guys weren't actually checking plain text files for any malicious content until they started to get wind of a malicious use of their site. And at that point, they started to actually scan these files and they started to block the attacker more and more, which led the attackers to have to switch infrastructure again. So as you see here, in 2022, the attackers started to use to host the next stage payloads directly on servers that they would rent, for example. And so in some of the cases, in some of the infection chains, they would just download directly from the IP address itself. Other times, they got free domains from DDNS services. And some of these domains that they registered were trying to mimic other types of financial institutions, kind of similar to what they were doing in their phishing emails. So lastly, I want to talk to you about the final C2 frameworks in the infection chains. So at the very beginning of the campaign, they were really just using Meterpreter shellcode from Metasploit. But in the middle of 2021, they started to move to POSH C2, which is when they started using more PowerShell. But in addition just to the 2 that I showed you here, we also saw them using another framework called AsyncRad, which is an open source tool available on GitHub. Here you can see the full timeline. Okay, so as you figured out by now, these guys really like to use open source tools. And so far I've mentioned POSH C2, Metasploit, and AsyncRad. But another tool we found connected to the campaign was called Backstab, which is an anti-EDR tool also available on GitHub. We also noticed some custom written tools that these guys used, like a really simple keylogger we found. But the keylogger didn't actually connect to any C2, so my guess is they probably downloaded it from one of their backdoors as a command, executed it, and then have a separate command to collect the keylogging data. But it really wasn't anything earth-shattering. Another thing we saw was a shellcode injector that they wrote, which basically just injected Meterpreter shellcode into Paint or Notepad or other processes like that. But it was really simple. It kind of looked like they just ripped this off from like a simple how-to guide on how to inject shellcode in C#. And as I've mentioned, these guys are really not this sophisticated, and thankfully, they didn't remove the PDB paths from their executables. This was our primary way of figuring out all the different files, how they were related to each other, based on the common username in these paths, Wall Street. So here you can see the PDB path to the keylogger that we found. And we found this also in the other open source tools that were compiled or in the other custom written tools they made. Here's an example of one of those injection loaders that injected interpreter shellcode into a process. Now, if you ignore the obfuscation, it's actually not so bad. Here, you can see the Windows API functions that they're using, including some of the most important ones for process injection, like open process, virtual allocx, write process memory, create remote thread. But after that, you can see there's this huge string of hex characters. Now, this is a reversed hex-encoded interpreter shellcode. So the injector basically just reverses the string, decodes it into bytes, and then after checking that mspaint.exe is not running, it'll inject this shellcode into that process. So this is a pretty basic script, pretty basic program they wrote. And like I said, it kind of looked like they just hacked it together from some how-to guide, but I think they felt like they were real hackers when they wrote this. Okay, let's take a look at a full example of an infection chain from the DangerousSavanna campaign. So first, we had the spear phishing emails with malicious document attached. Then the document would drop an LNK file to disk, typically in the startup file, in the startup folder, which would allow it to be executed on the next startup instead of just executing in PowerShell right away. So on the next startup, it runs first a CMD, and then it runs PowerShell, and then that PowerShell will download a POSH-C2 implant. Once it executes the POSH-C2 implant, it talks to the POSH-C2 server, waiting for commands, and when those commands are executed, it returns back the information to the server. So, upon infecting a machine, the malware in this campaign was usually seen patching two API functions, AMSI scan buffer and ETW write event. AMSI scan buffer is a function that's often patched in order to bypass AMSI, which is a framework for detecting malicious script content in real time before it gets executed, such as with PowerShell. ETW write event, this is an API that's used to send ETW events to the kernel. So by patching it in that process, ETW events will no longer be sent. And this is something that a lot of EDR tools use to collect data and then make detections on. Now, if you're wondering if these guys actually wrote that code on their own, no, they also took this from GitHub. But another notable evasion technique that these guys used was shellcode injection, as I mentioned earlier. They would use this, but the way that they use it here was to they would send commands to their backdoor to inject the backdoor shellcode into another process after post-infection. And basically, they would inject it into like runtimebroker.exe or other benign Windows processes to try to, in hopes that it would be overlooked. Now, the threat actor also sent commands to the backdoor to ensure persistent access. So they would usually drop scripts to disk, then hide them, mark them as hidden, and then create scheduled tasks to make sure that they would get run periodically, making sure there's always at least a backdoor being run. We also saw a bunch of reconnaissance commands being sent to the backdoor post-infection. Now, some of these were built into the POSH-C2 implant, but we also saw scripts that seemed to be gathered from different websites on the internet. For example, they would typically do screen captures every now and then, which was something built into POSH-C2. They also ran some other PowerShell scripts called get-ipconfig and another one that was an ARP scanner, and these were to collect information about the network around them. Perhaps this was to try to understand how to proceed next for lateral movement. And sometimes the threat actor even added other backdoors even though they already had one installed. For example, we saw them installing a legitimate remote access tool called DW service, but they tried to masquerade it as an Intel service. Basically, DW service kind of gives them more of a nice UI, like something like RDP, probably so that they can access the machine more easily instead of just sending commands to the back door. In another case, we saw the attacker downloading a PyInstaller executable, which just simply ran another PowerShell, which then just connected to another POSH-C2 server. It was pretty clumsily put together. Speaking of which, let's talk about some of the funny things these guys did. Now, in that PyInstaller executable I was just talking about, the attacker compiled a short Python script into an executable just to run a PowerShell. Why? I really don't know. But when they first ran the PowerShell that they ran in the script, they used an AMSI bypass technique where they look for this field called AMSI init failed and set it to true. And what does that tell PowerShell? It says that AMSI didn't fail to initialize, so no need to bother with it. We're not going to send any data to AMSI. Great, that's very cool. But then at the very last line of this script in PowerShell, they execute a new PowerShell, which then doesn't have the AMSI bypass. So it seems like these guys are just copy-pasting AMSI bypass without understanding how it works. But that's what they did. Another thing they did, in one of the later payloads, they had a ISO which contained an LNK file inside. And now, and this was one of the later infection chains where the user clicks the LNK file and it runs a backdoor. But in this ISO, we also found another file which appeared to be a PNG file at first. I figured it's probably not really a PNG. Maybe it's something like encrypted shellcode, or maybe a DLL that it wants to sideload. Something kind of cool. But instead, it turned out to actually be a Word document. And not only was it a Word document, but it was a Word document with a broken macro with a different infection chain that was actually relevant to like 6 months before that. And the macro didn't work. But my favorite part was that there was an unused function in this macro called launch, which simply launched calculator.exe. Kind of pointless. Okay, so let's wrap up. We saw a 2-year-long campaign against financial institutions in French-speaking countries in Africa. It's possible that these companies were targeted because of Africa's growing economy, and they're becoming more and more connected to the internet, which means they don't have as much experience in technological security. We also saw that the threat actor was pretty unsophisticated, given their high reliance on open source tools and their poorly written custom tools and general clumsiness. But perhaps the biggest concern of all here was that this group went undetected for nearly 2 years. Such a simple group went undetected. It's kind of mind-blowing to me. But I think one of the biggest takeaways from this is a growing need for awareness of cybersecurity, especially in places that are becoming more and more connected to the internet, in developing countries like in Africa. It's something that we need to take more seriously and start to research more. So if you guys are interested, please check out our blog post on Checkpoint Research, on this research. There's also a nice follow-up article that was written by the Microsoft Defender Threat Intelligence team that you can find on RiskIQ. Thank you guys so much. Does anybody have any questions?
Hello.
That's a really good question. So he asked, what was the end goal of this campaign? It is a very good question. It's something I wish I could have mentioned here, but because we didn't actually see a full, we didn't see enough data to really understand what they were doing, the best guess I can give you is that it was money related. They're looking for money because they're attacking financial institutions. So maybe they're looking for accounts, something like that, but we don't actually know, unfortunately. So we didn't see any ransomware. There was nothing like that. It seems like maybe they were just trying to steal financial information and trying to get access to like bank accounts, things like that. But we don't know for sure.
Okay. Any more questions?